Very kind. Cool. So I'm glad that Juan kind of transitioned us into design mode and also has touched on kind of methodologies in a way. Oh, check. All right, I'm back. Wonderful. So I would like to speak with you on what is titled a governance layer for the decentralized web. And now this is a culmination of over 12 months of research that I was grateful to be supported by Protocol Labs to conduct. But actually it's a major study of my PhD research on resilience in decentralized technologies. And so I'm a social scientist. My primary method is ethnography, which is the study of people and culture and community. And so when I approached Protocol Labs and kind of told them about my research, I wanted to know who are the people using IPFS, what for, what are their threat models, and then what happens when they do. And that data wasn't kind of readily available, and so we'll talk about it today. So really this fits within a broader picture of funding the commons, and I think this is grounded and actionable in relation to this question of how is data governed and governable for those that create it or create value from it. So what we're doing here in the context of IPFS and Filecoin is thinking about decentralized data infrastructure. And so I very much approach this research from an infrastructure studies lens, which acknowledges the social and technical components of infrastructures as broader, scalable, enabling substrates for other activities. So as I mentioned, a lot of qualitative research, ethnography occurs through observation, interviews, as well as practice. So I joined Filecoin hackathons in the Oceania region. I hung out in Discord channels. I observed CIDs disappearing from whole NFT collections and getting recovered, and all of these kinds of events in different contexts. And so I wanted to point you to a working paper that's publicly available on this. The actual final version has been peer-reviewed by IEEE and will be published. And shout out to Yanis from ResNet Labs within Protocol Labs, who was one of the reviewers on that, with very valuable feedback. And so in thinking about IPFS as a decentralized technology and a component of kind of broader scale digital infrastructures, what's really important and the kind of theoretical linchpin of the way that I looked at these was this idea of gateway moments. And now gateway moments are when an infrastructure is thought to be most fragile, and that's when previously separate systems are linked, whether they're legal, political, or technological, for broader growth and scale of a network, or the ongoing process of adaptation to changes in circumstances and environment. And so in thinking about resilience is obviously very important, and when thinking about content addressing, you have IPFS, which is its own distinct thing, the wonderful tool that it is, which creates those CIDs, so it changes the way we can locate content digitally from HTTP, which does location addressing, to IPFS, which creates a CID. But then it has to be linked to a storage solution. So you could rely on the IPFS network to replicate your data, but the whole idea of cryptoeconomic systems is that there's some kind of hard incentive. And so that solution might be Filecoin. In a lot of ways, we think that the two are interlinked, but there's a gateway moment between the two. So what do I mean by resilience? I mentioned these social and technical components that are inextricably linked in digital infrastructures. And so the understanding of resilience I was bringing to this investigation was this idea of adaptability and transformability in response to threat or crisis. But when I started speaking to people, I found out that people had different definitions. So ResNet Labs, which is a technically focused research and development lab within Protocol Labs, defines resilience on their website as a network that is fundamentally uncompromised by an isolated failure or a network split. The system is malleable, adaptable to different conditions, and capable of evolving to meet new requirements over time. So that's a very technically focused definition that really emphasizes the resilience of the technology itself. When I spoke to Molly McKinlay, the head of engineering, product and research at PL, she had a different definition again that kind of talks about this, the broader sweeping, vision of linking content that is addressed to provable storage over time. But when I spoke to end users in various contexts, it emerged that resilience relates to data integrity in line with the preferences and local context of the provider of that data. And so next I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what some of those local contexts were. If you're interested in the methodology of how I conducted this research or what it means to find out about resilience in the broad sphere of decentralized technology, I open source blog a lot of my methods and kind of initial findings as I myself investigate. And I'm actually speaking on Friday afternoon in the DeSci track specifically on methods for researching decentralized governance, so some kind of DAO science stuff. But just at a high level, this was one of the initial mapping exercises that I did, which kind of just tries to break down the specific and kind of concrete elements that I'm looking for. So I wanted to know, what's the use case? What's the purpose or the objective of the people using these tools or infrastructures? What's the threat model of these stakeholders? What are their vulnerabilities? And vulnerabilities emerged in the literature as this relational notion to resilience by which to kind of observe it. And then in terms of the action space, how are people responding? So what's happening in the social and the technical dynamics or other dynamics of a system to actually adapt and change or fail or die and resurrect in response to the threat models? And then, of course, what happens and the role of an ethnographer in communicating these feedback loops. So some of the people that I spoke to that I've written into full case studies in that working paper include Matters News. So they're a crowdsourced blog website. So they have a front-end website, but what they allow is for crowdsourced content to be uploaded to their platform. And so this is really valuable in parts of Asia where perhaps content might be censored or might not be sort of persistently available just through a static front end. And they had a very interesting setup. They automatically upload content to IPFS when members upload a blog. And then they run their own servers that are actually physically, geographically distributed with IPFS nodes. So they have multiple IPFS nodes running. And they are running an application that mirrors that data, so it follows specific CIDs and makes sure that it's replicating them. In contrast, and in another part of the world, in Latin America, Omnilingo is an early-stage research project into recording people speaking in their local languages to actually use Mozilla's Common Voice database to train an app to help people learn those languages. So it's actually a really important exercise in cultural knowledge preservation. But what I found here is that the founder, who is also a university academic, was incredibly skeptical of cryptocurrencies. And his kind of anecdote in a research interview is that, I hate cryptocurrencies. I got paid a grant around my integration and to support my project, but by the time I got the cryptocurrency to my wallet, it went down and I can't afford to fix the hole in the roof in my house. And so that's so true, and that, bridge between the ideals of, cryptoeconomic networks and the actual, feeling someone said on a call this week. Like, you have to know that your heart beats faster when you send a transaction kind of out of terror and excitement. I was like, very true. And so for Omnilingo, in this case, in this local context, perhaps a better idea that was shared in this interview was, what would it look like for the people actually recording their voices to maybe run an IPFS node and make a local copy on a hard drive of that data. And then maybe the local language institute could also operate an IPFS node and make local backups of that. And we can have this, community to make sure that the data is replicated, but it's actually controlled and maintained and managed within its local context rather than abstracted to the world's largest decentralized, storage network. But you might be negotiating storage deals, with someone on the other side of the world. You don't know kind of where that data actually ends up and how it's managed. And of course, I don't say that as a generalization. I know you can upload very small amounts of content to Filecoin, and there's also amazing, specific case applications that are emerging, like NFT storage and Web3 storage. But I want to bring it back to this idea of resilience in the local context. And so one of the other examples I talk about is Starling Lab, and Jonathan Doughton is around here somewhere, actually, the founder of that. And now that's a broader scale experiment, really, based at Stanford in partnership with the USC Shoah Foundation. And they're trying to look at provable data throughout the kind of life cycle of a data pipeline from where it is captured. So they're working with kind of frontier hardware development. So how can I take a photo, for example, of a war crime? And there's a fascinating article I was just reading today on their website about work they've been doing in the Ukraine. With a timestamp, a geolocation stamp, etc., and then kind of map that data, encrypt it, but have it across all like this patchwork of decentralized technologies that each kind of contribute a different thing. So, content, address it on IPFS, upload it to Filecoin, make a copy of it on Gun Network, and so on. And so again, that's really about resilient data, meaning the integrity of that data in line with the preference to be able to bring it to court as evidence, potentially, or to not have history changed when there's elections and, tweets kind of come and go, or photos are, potentially doctored, and so on. And so we see these passive and active threat models. State-level censorship of your content is very different to Omnilingo, who's paying a server as a service provider in Germany €35 a month for the actual storage component, which is completely insecure, to Starling Lab and kind of having to engage with legal requirements. And so really, at this gateway moment of bridging content addressing and storage, we see these very bespoke linkages. And so these were kind of my high-level findings and takeaway from this research. I think, number one, that the social coordination layer around how data is managed is inextricably linked to the actual technical infrastructure. And so one of the first times I spoke on this to a very technical audience of software developers and kind of protocol researchers, someone in the audience asked the question, like, so you're telling me that the technology is good, but the social breaks down? And I was like, no, because they're inextricably linked. The infrastructure studies literature talks about, a tool is only a tool when it's used. And so same with infrastructure. Part of it becoming infrastructure is the active process of infrastructuring, which means that people use it. And actually the coordination around it is inherently incredibly important. And so institutional infrastructure is these processes that surround that coordination to enable and constrain the operation of infrastructure. And I also wanted to point out that, while there is this kind of this finding around these further opportunities to think about potential patterns for coordination around data governance, that some people found that, even though there's kind of limitations and the network is under development, or they didn't like certain components such as cryptocurrency, IPFS still provided a solution that was more resilient than alternatives such as HTTPS for certain threat models, which is why these people were using it in the first place. And so here we transition from the kind of empirical findings to the more sort of speculative open space for further research directions, and kind of what I hope to engage all of you in. And so what could these decentralized institutional infrastructure models look like? Are they DAOs? And I loved a talk earlier this morning which kind of spoke about, DAOs to govern the commons. But what does that mean? We know that a DAO is not a defined thing. There's no kind of concrete pattern that, it utilizes the blockchain somewhere, but in what ways, we don't know. And in many cases, governance is relegated to voting processes when we know that there's still a whole lot of, social processes that are inherent in the politicking of facilitating those governance processes. Could it look like data trusts? And actually, there's an incredible amount of value in looking at existing cooperative governance models that existed pre-crypto. So I've got some working papers that are on SSRN on cooperatives and DAOs, and then I've mentioned the one here on DAOs as data trusts. So the initial version of that was written in 2021. The link there is actually 2022. And the idea there is there's really fantastic research and actually practices going on around, bottom-up, kind of vulnerable constituencies being able to work together to have, like legal representation, advocate on their behalf as a kind of a fiduciary for data. And that paper kind of says, hey, this is what DAOs want to do. Instead of appointing a lawyer to act, in line with the law on behalf of a group's preferences and represent them in how data is utilized, sold, monetized, used for research, and so on. The rules are just encoded in the rules of the DAO, and you could have protocols interacting and doing that for you. So that's like a very active area of research. And then some of the reviewer feedback on the initial version of that ethnographic research was, what could this look like as protocol level governance? And obviously that's not my area of expertise, but they mentioned sort of how the kind of fundamental protocols of the internet works. But again, someone pointed out today that still requires people to fly around the world and, negotiate those SLAs and operate that infrastructure, which has become very centralized. And so as part of this kind of speculative design space, I wanted to transition to talk about pathetic dot theory. So this is more focused on regulation specifically as kind of a subset of thinking about governance. But really what I'm pointing out in this slide is that there's more than just technical forces that influence and regulate behavior. So unfortunately, each of us is the pathetic dot in this structure. Yeah, hands up. And so, thinking about these forces, we can also think about them as levers when we want to design effective models in different contexts as patterns to govern data. And when looking at regulation, I wanted to point out another piece entitled Algorithms as Policy, and this is still in the blog post phase. It was we haven't transformed it yet into a research paper, but it was co-written with my colleague from Block Science, Michael Zargam, and he's actually done a Funding of the Commons talk on specifically this topic of algorithms as policy. But the idea is that in regulating, we're actually taking law as code in a lot of crypto economic systems and trying to kind of translate policy level decisions into algorithmic systems. So then we have to think of algorithms as policy, which means going back to the policy making processes that acknowledge the social dynamics. And so I thought this was a really nice quote that was on 20 years of reflecting on Lessig's work on the laws of cyberspace. And so, coming back to that broad lens of how do we get, more resilient, decentralized infrastructures, rather than, having this last-minute policy approach like, oh, we need governance or the social stuff is messy and hard and political, perhaps we can, paint those objectives to start out with and actually think this through now before just implementing the things and, moving fast and breaking things and hope we don't destroy the world. And so this is my very initial thinking on what some of these models look like, and it's an area that I'm intending to focus my research on for 12 months to come and continuing in relationship with Protocol Labs on that. And so here I'm invoking this idea of self-infrastructuring. And this is an idea that comes out of my PhD research as kind of a core finding. And it's that resilience in decentralized technologies is the idea that you're infrastructuring, so you're engaging with infrastructure as an active process of doing, but it's self-infrastructuring. The whole kind of crux from the history to the kind of modern day manifestations of decentralized technologies is that, people want to operate their own infrastructure or not have a third party that could be, corrupted or co-opted do it for them. And so coming from this lens, we need to be sensitive to those local contexts with IPFS as well, of what does it look like for people to be able to self-infrastructure, but still bridge that gateway moment to store their data in line with their preferences. It doesn't mean storing it forever. It might mean storing it for a very short term and actually being able to ask nodes to take it off IPFS network. And so what some of these pictures mean, and I've got time to talk to them, which is cool. So what some of these pictures are initial models. And so rather than just talk about, a broad data DAO as a model, I mentioned there's not kind of great patterns or definitions of what a DAO actually is. I've drawn a very bad picture of the viable systems model. So another piece of research by Michael Zagam and myself looks at how cybernetic principles align with decentralized governance. And what VSM gives us is pretty much a map and a toolkit to look at any system and see what essential components to make that system viable are missing. And so oftentimes that could be conflict resolution. So every DAO, to be a viable system, needs conflict resolution. It needs forward planning. So it needs the ability to look forward, look outwards at environmental factors and think strategically about those and plan for those. This also shows how operational units in a DAO can be as autonomous as possible while still kind of accountable to the greater whole or create wholeness in the system through the process of meta-governance. So you can go read all about that, but that provides one generalizable pattern of a data DAO, which has, the components needed to make a viable system of governance or a viable organization. A local first consortium, so coming back to that idea of omnilingo, maybe because it is, culturally sensitive data specific to a geographic community that doesn't need to be abstracted to a global storage network, people can engage in, operating IPFS nodes within the local community, and then they can all store that on a local hard drive, on their local computer. And that could be a generalizable pattern for where something starts. And, one of my research questions moving forward is, at what point does something become scaled? So what kinds of data or what kind of contexts need to be local first, and what kinds can be, absolutely amazing, put it on IPFS, engage in the cryptoeconomic incentives of that system. That's the right thing for that data set. Marketplaces for storage and retrieval. So Filecoin is one example of that, and I assume people are broadly familiar with how that works. And then, self-storage. So that's another use case example where, things don't need to be uploaded to a peer-to-peer network. Obviously, IPFS is not natively encrypted, and maybe you just want to store it yourself. And so I've mentioned some of these further research directions as I've gone. What is local and what is scalable? Data DAOs, in practice, super nascent area. I know there's workshopping going on now on one of them. But, how do you build a data DAO? What are the limitations of that as well? And then thinking about those four forces of regulation, so the market, the social norms, the technology, and the architecture, so the infrastructure and kind of structures of society as kind of tools in how we sort of pattern out these different generalizable models. And so if you're interested in this, I am told that there's like an unconference session on Saturday afternoon as part of IPFS Camp, and I would love to get together and kind of research these and kind of generate some kind of pattern language that we can publish and hopefully with the support of Protocol Labs share out. And, you know, this whole kind of exercise of looking at, you know, end users and real use cases of IPFS and resilience, or through a lens of resilience, is about this broader mission to improve the internet and computing generally. Thank you. So I do have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any.
When looking at resiliency of networks like IPFS, how important do you think it is to sort of have the network self-reflect? By that I mean essentially be able to tell how much a data set is replicated across the network, so you can determine if you need to incentivize its replication further, and how impactful that data set might be to the rest of the network. And the more impactful, the more it should be incentivized to replicate. So yeah, how important is it to self-reflect as a network?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that there, about 3 months ago in July, when I last checked with Yanis from Protocol Labs, there was incentives out around tools to actually map the network. So I think there's, you know, kind of over a year ago when I started the research, there was very little information about, you know, where IPF nodes are hosted kind of geographically around the world. But I think there's more and more tools out there to help kind of crawl and map the network pretty much. When you mentioned reflective, I was thinking about the ethnographic practice of reflexivity, and I was like, yes, people have to reflect on their practices. But that's another question, I guess, in terms of, you know, how much should be replicated across the network, and should people do that out of the, you know, that's a social norm model really, around just out of the goodness of your IPFS node, keep hosting it and replicate other people's stuff. But really the networks, it's not designed to do that, you know, long term or in line with people's kind of context or preferences of how that data is stored or where or by whom. Other questions?
Thank you. Really nice talk. I guess what stuck out for me in the VSM model was the anticipatory system, and I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the modes of forecasting futures in order to reduce potential contingencies, by which I mean data getting taken offline, or, you know, what parts of your infrastructure are necessarily self-hosted versus other parts that are not. Yeah, if you've got thoughts, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I point out in you know, in writing about the VSM and drawing on cybernetics, I'm not a control theorist. I worked with one to do that research. But what you're referring to there is called meta-governance in the viable system model. And so that's the kind of, it's compared to the human body. So that's like the kind of higher order thinking part of the body that's able to look, you know, across the system itself and see how everything's tracking, each of the operational functions, but also able to look outwards at the external environment. And so in a traditional corporation, that would just be like, you know, the C-suite, you know, and the annual kind of strategy meeting and quarterly reports or whatever. You know, in a DAO, what does that look like for people to think beyond their daily operation? I think that's, yeah, that's probably an open area of research. But, you know, drawing on these kinds of provocations around, you know, even the threat models, like I said, you know, if people are thinking, well, my, you know, state government might censor my blog content because I want to write about what I want to write about, that's hard to forward plan for. But obviously, yeah, very has strong implications for the resiliency of that data itself. So a good question for further research. Thank you. Cool. We're at time. Thank you.